Welcome. It's 5 o'clock. We will start. I'm Marcy Winograd. I'm sure everybody's heard the news now about the Chauvin verdict. And I think attention is probably turned to the television set or the internet right now. But just to restate, he was found guilty, Derek Chauvin, of 3 counts, murder, with not with intent, but murder nonetheless. And his family, George Floyd's family, raised their fists, said say his name, and said justice, is far from met. But we certainly in the meantime need to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. So you may want to check to see if your representative is one of the co-sponsors of that bill, and there are 119 co-sponsors. Justice and Policing Act. Okay. Anyway. I'm very thrilled to be with you tonight and to be with our Youth Peace Collective in the run-up to Earth Day. And they're going to be co-hosting, CODEPINK Congress tonight. We thought it was fitting since, they're going to be facing climate chaos unless we're able to reverse it somehow. So I want to introduce Natalia Cardona, who is the founder of our Youth Peace Collective at CODEPINK, and she will in turn introduce the others.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So the Peace Collective is an anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist for a world free from neoliberal greed and violence. We support and affirm the right to self-determination for all peoples, especially those in the global South, as they resist the colonial domination of the U.S. empire. The Peace Collective is made up of people under the age of 30 who come together for anti-imperialist education in the form of book clubs and discussions. Collective members have opportunities to start or get connected to divestment campaigns in their area to gain anti-war organizing experience, as well as other CODEPINK campaigns around the country and world. If you're under 30 here and you want to join the Peace Collective, you can go to codepink.org/Peace Collective. And if you're a supporter of young people in the peace movement, you can go to codepink.org/Peace Collective and read our manifesto and see what we're up to. Our co-hosts today are Maryam Guerrab and Miguel Flores. As I understand, Miguel is having camera issues, but his sound works okay. Miguel Flores is part of the CODEPINK Peace Collective. He works as a grant writer and marketing manager for a nonprofit in Newark, New Jersey, and is an English teacher for a federal TRIO program targeting high school students from low-income communities. Miguel and his family immigrated to New Jersey from Ecuador after the 1990s economic crisis. Maryam Guerrab is a first-generation Algerian American based in Raleigh, North Carolina. She is a dually enrolled student at Wake STEM Early College and North Carolina State University. In her hometown, she is a children's rights advocate with NC Child and a math instructor at Mathnasium Tutoring Center. She was previously a youth advocate at Youth Empowered Solutions and worked on initiatives ranging from racial equity, youth empowerment, healthcare equity, and climate change. She is currently a part of CODEPINK's Peace Collective and is passionate about working towards a demilitarized and peaceful world. And with that, I will pass it over to Maryam and Miguel.
Yes, Maryam and Miguel, if you want to say a few words about how or why you got involved in the peace movement, and then we can go to our video that Mary has based on an article written by our co-founder, Medea Benjamin.
Well, hi everyone, my name is Maryam. Thank you guys for having me tonight. I know I am passionate about the peace movement in general because, as Anika mentioned, I am Algerian American. So growing up right in an Arab community, I always saw how American intervention and American colonialism, right, impacts the Middle East and surrounding regions. And really, like, growing up with this experience got me passionate about the peace movement and ensuring that we are working towards a world that puts peace and diplomacy at its forefront rather than militarism, war, and conflict. So yeah, thank you guys for having me again.
Great. And Miguel, can you hear us?
Yep, I can hear you guys.
You are.
So so my name is Miguel. And I got involved into I guess the peace movement. I've always growing up in Ecuador and stuff like that during an economic crisis, I saw a lot of people's kind of lives go wrong based on, policies from governments and stuff like that. So I was kind of into that sort of stuff, and just wondering, like, like what people in power do always ends up impacting, the people you grew up with and the people in your neighborhood, and the people you see as you walk by in a city. And coming to America, that kind of those power dynamics always stuck with me. And as I grew up, I realized that the militarism in this country is probably, out of all the things wrong in this country, if I may be frank, it's probably one of the most outrageous ones. And the way that it's culturally ingrained into every aspect of like our society and our day-to-day lives is frankly scary. So I'd like to thank Danica for finally reeling me into actually getting involved and doing things in the peace movement rather than just talking about it with friends or other stuff.
Well, on behalf of the whole team at CODEPINK and CODEPINK Congress, I want to thank you, Miguel and Maryam and Danica, for co-hosting tonight. At this point, let's go to the video. Mary, if we have that, that's based on an article Medea Benjamin wrote in 2019, I believe, on climate and militarism. Thank you, Medea Benjamin, and thank you, Nicholas Davies, and thank you, Michelle Elner, who produced the film based on the article. Miguel, perhaps you can review the agenda with us? before we start with our speakers?
Yeah, of course. Well, we just went through our welcome and introductions, and then we're gonna have our first speaker, Natalia Cardona, the Associate Director of Equity and Justice at 350.org talk. Then we'll have our second speaker, Garett Reppenhagen, Executive Director of Veterans for Peace. We're gonna have a quick question and answer session. You guys can put your questions right on the chat, and then we'll have a capital calling party at the end of everything.
Terrific.
And for all our attendees tonight, please be sure to stay all the way until the end of the event so that everyone can participate in making calls to your congressional leaders and emailing the White House to oppose President Biden's increased military budget. Because after all, the Pentagon is the largest institutional emitter of greenhouse gases and contributor to climate change. So be sure to stay on.
I will.
And I'd also like to invite everyone to sign up to be a congressional district liaison to organize delegations to your congressperson's office. Everyone is also welcome to join our CODEPINK Congress Google group for the latest announcements of what we'll be up to next.
Terrific. Okay, let's introduce our first speaker, Natalia.
All right. So first and foremost, Natalia, thank you for coming. So Natalia is the Associate Director for Justice and Equity at 350.org in the United States. Originally from Guatemala, Natalia was forced to immigrate to Canada with her family at the age of 11 due to a civil war in her home country, an experience that has marked her activism and movements for social justice. Natalia has worked for the American Friends Service Committee, the Center for Women's Global Leadership at Rutgers University, Social Watch, and most recently with the Association for Women's Rights in Development, a global feminist network. So please join me in welcoming Natalia Cardona.
Thank you so much. It's really nice to be here. I love the video. It made so many connections. As you mentioned, I'm originally from Guatemala, where we felt a lot of the impact of US military foreign policy. And it's one of the reasons why the Civil War lasted so long and a genocide occurred in my home country. So I'm often looking at different policies from the perspective of how military foreign policy in the United States impacts our work. And in the US, 350 has just started to look at the increasing militarization of climate policy. And we're just following the issue right now under the guise of making it a national security issue, which we all know and understand in Central America and in South America. When something becomes a national security issue, it becomes an issue that's actually, the response to it will be significantly militarized and highly violent. So that's become a concern for us. And I know under Trump, many environmentalists thought that the fact that the Army was able to speak about climate change in its reports was a good thing. But what that actually means is that both Trump and other administrations, other Democratic administrations, have all been united in looking at climate policy as something that should be dealt as a military issue and not as an issue of human rights or an issue of human security. Unfortunately, when our country speaks of national security, they speak of militarization, and that's just what we've seen throughout history. So I'm just going to talk about the present and a little bit about some of the main events around how we've seen climate policy become more militarized. As we all know, in the first month of the Biden presidency, there was a lot of climate action and a lot of sweeping away of the openly denialist intransigence of the Trump administration. But after re-entering the Paris Agreement and canceling KXL pipeline on day one, which we were all very happy about it and elated, President Biden actually rolled out an array of climate-related executive orders, calling on all agencies to factor climate into their work. Top among them was an order to center the climate crisis in US foreign policy and national security. That executive order actually went with very much unnoticed. both within the movement and in the media. And part of this order actually orders officials from across more than a dozen intelligence agencies, including the CIA, to produce a national intelligence estimate over the next 4 months. Well, those 4 months are almost over, on the national and economic security impacts of climate change. This high-level analysis is designated as is supposed to designate significant threats to the United States as it relates to climate change. And the process actually can lead to unlocking huge amount of resources from across agencies if so-called serious risks are identified. And what we've been noticing is that, and we've seen throughout the years, is that largely any meaningful response, any response, not necessarily meaningful, excuse me, to climate change has been as a security issue. And we don't have to look too far to see some of these examples. In Texas, where there were power failures recently because of the rolling state blackouts because of a major cold snap that left millions without heat and electricity. The governor, without having any ability to do anything else or call on any other agency, called the National Guard to respond to that. This is increasingly of concern, particularly because undocumented people who are first responders and are most impacted by climate change, and LGBTQI folks who, and transgender folks, particularly, who are most impacted by, militarism and police violence, won't go to access resources if they're being provided by folks with guns and military uniforms. Also, what we find is that the military is just not equipped to deal with the kinds of things that happen during climate impacts. Still, we do think that climate change should be taken seriously as a foreign policy issue, but unfortunately, the way that the US government and this administration is framing and driving the policy is in framing it as national security issue, it's really about militarizing a response. And we saw this as recently as 2015, where the political media was treating candidate Bernie Sanders as ridiculous for claiming that climate change was the greatest threat to national security. But after 4 years of Trump's backsliding, we've seen a lot of alarm about climate impacts, and framing climate as a central threat has become common political wisdom. It's quite dangerous because, again, the response that we have to threats aren't humanitarian responses. They tend to be militarized responses, and responses that tend to be about protecting resources and extraction of resources. So what kind of security is most useful as against the climate crisis? We believe it's mutual security, which promotes cooperation against our common planetary threat. And really, we believe that responding to the climate crisis, what's necessary for it is to have global cooperation across the world, including a clear humanitarian framework for how the climate crisis should reshape foreign policy. Framing it narrowly in terms of national security risks reinforcing America's militarized approach to the rest of the world. And it raises the risk of more war and instability. It's most urgent to build cooperation and international solidarity that's necessary for a green global economy and collective survival. So what kind of conclusions could an NIE find? The US, there's some unsettling hints. So for example, Pentagon planners were presenting the climate crisis as a national security threat as early as 2003. But rather than emphasizing the need to accelerate the green transition, their reports are often resigned to an armed Lightfoot approach to the planet overheating. They call for reinforcing military bases, preparing for war, locking down the border, and even using counterinsurgency tactics against civilians to contain societal unrest. So recent reports have also been getting more specific about the vast array of new and militarized resources that that the military might use and the circumstances in which they might use them. So in 2019, an analysis by the Army War College warns that the US military is precariously unprepared for the intensifying climate crisis, laying out possible future sites of global conflict in a new era of endless war. Naturally, the proposed solutions amount to increased funding for combat preparedness in a diverse array of scenarios. So this report also raises the possibility of expanded domestic military operations inside the US to deal with climate-related emergencies like pandemics, like COVID, shortages, and even energy grid blackouts. A scenario much like what we were seeing in Texas. So in the absence of a robust civilian public services to respond to such crises, governors and different government officials in different states have resorted to using National Guard troops. So the report also suggests that the US Army might provide military training to Bangladesh, an already highly militarized government prosecuting a brutal drug war amid extreme inequality. And the analysts further note that over 600 million people live at sea level globally, implying many more regions that might invite military intervention, especially where the US military bases already exist. There are other scenarios as well where they lay out the prospect of militarizing the Arctic amid rapidly melting polar ice caps to ward off newly expansionist Russia. And the American Security Project says a think tank whose board includes Biden's new climate envoy, John Kerry, names the security challenge of a melting Arctic among its top 3 priorities for the Biden administration, emphasizing the need to show allies that the US means business in the Arctic. Yeah, I think lastly, I'd just like to mention that we need an urgent reality check on the presumptions baked into those dire visions, and we should be really, as environmentalists and as peace activists, working more closely together in pushing for an investment in climate policy and a global humanitarian response, and an exercise in grading civilian control over military resources, and always resorting to expecting troops to intervene in crisis they're ill-equipped to handle. We can start by asking folks in the administration to really think about where we're putting our resources. And as these agencies are coming back in for monthly reports on how national security and other so-called threats might be impacting the country, we need to push to advocate for a different response from this government. The last thing I'll say, sorry, just one last thing. The US military itself is a massive greenhouse polluter and has over 800 overseas military bases, many of which are increasingly at risk for climate change. And they should also be prompted to make a change in the way that they operate in relationship to fossil fuels. Thank you, Marcy.
Thank you, Natalia. I'm sure people will have questions for you in a few minutes. Miguel, you want to introduce Garett?
I was muted. Yeah, of course. So yeah, thank you, Natalia. So our next speaker is Garett Reppenhagen. He is the Executive Director of Veterans for Peace, which has organized a climate working group to inform others about the link between militarism and the climate crisis. Garett is the son of a Vietnam veteran and a grandson of 2 World War II veterans. He served in the US Army as a cavalry scout sniper in the 1st Infantry Division, completed a peacekeeping deployment in Kosovo and a combat tour in Baklava, Iraq. In 2005, Garett gained an honorable discharge and began working as a veterans advocate. He served as chair of the Board of Iraq Veterans Against the War, worked in DC as a lobbyist, and as vice president of public relations for Veterans for America. So I'd like to welcome Garett Reppenhagen.
Awesome. Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, CODEPINK. You know, it's you might hear my son back there screaming and yelling and doing flips. I apologize, but he's home from school and having fun, and in a large part, this is why I'm doing this. So, yeah, thank you for the warm introduction, and Natalia. incredible presentation. I should just concede all my time to you because you knocked it out of the park and all those things. Yeah, Veterans for Peace has been working with, trying to address climate change for a while and the connections with militarism. And, it's been a long road for me, honestly. I didn't come out of the military as an environmentalist right away. It's kind of coming to terms with my military service and really the moral injury that I incurred from perpetrating so much violence on people overseas is what made an activist out of me, trying to find a way to mitigate some of the harm that I did, turned me into an anti-war activist first. And I was the first active duty member of Iraq Veterans Against the War while I still was serving as a sniper overseas, and barely got that honorable discharge. I was under investigation for the ways I was protesting already within the military and my GI resistance. And after years of working with Iraq Veterans Against the War and Veterans for Peace, I almost became totally disillusioned with the peace movement because there's so many root foundations of why we perpetuate war in the world. And, I felt like at the time we were doing a lot of activism on the street, a lot of just protest mobilizations. And, I felt powerless in a lot of ways, even marching with hundreds of thousands of people in Washington, D.C., I felt powerless. And the realities that, I was coming to terms with is the fact that I went to war for oil and I went to war for capitalism and the military industrial complex. And I needed to find ways that I could penetrate those foundations that supported war. And that's why I started becoming an environmentalist and an environmental activist. And I worked for a long time. I created an organization called Veterans Green Jobs, helping veterans get plugged into green opportunities, to get retrained, to work in solar fields and wind turbines and, wilderness restoration operations. And that was really rewarding, but I wasn't addressing the policies. So I started working for Vote Vets. It was their C3 operation, Vet Voice Foundation. And I was able to actually work on policy conservation and get active in Washington, D.C. and become a lot more educated on these issues. And it's funny you bring up the Arctic, because one of my pivotal experiences was I was able to take a 13-day canoe trip down the Canning River in the Arctic. And it's the border of the Arctic Wildlife Refuge. And on the last day, when we reached the Arctic Sea, you could actually see Point Thompson, which is a massive oil drilling operation just on the horizon. And you could stand within the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and see this massive thing. They have 2 flights a day coming in and out of this facility to bring workers back and forth. And, they're drilling and doing seismic testing in the Arctic. And I'm standing there looking at Point Thompson on the horizon. And in the beach sand right in front of me is a footprint of a polar bear. And, at first I was a little excited and then a little scared because there was a polar bear right there. And, then I was just filled with this sadness. It was July. If in fact it was July 5th, the day after 4th of July. We spent the 4th of July up there in the Arctic, and it was too early for polar bears to be on land. There normally still is ice flow, and they're usually out in the bay hunting seals. And here was evidence of a footprint of a polar bear that was already starving in July and getting ready to go through a very, very difficult summer. And the damage that was causing this was now right there. It was living in the shadow of the thing that was doing the incredible amount of damage. And I know from somebody who fought in a war for oil, that wherever there's natural resource production, the military follows. We talk a lot about the emissions of the military and how bad it is, but I think some of those points that Natalia and Medea mentioned is that our military reinforces extractive colonialism. It reinforces exploiting vulnerable nations, mostly in the global South. And it reinforces the protection of transportation of fossil fuels. And it trains people in the School of Americas to go back to their countries, mostly in the global South, and to punish and hurt and suppress and oppress indigenous and community resistance against fossil fuel production and against colonialism. And those things would not be possible without the U.S. military support. And, I was a member of this operation in a way. It's tragic. I think that any environmentalist has to also be a peace activist. And any environmentalist and peace activist also has to be an anti-capitalist. And, if we're going to survive this at all, we have to understand the intersections of these movements and how they're all the same and how we're all fighting together. And we have to break down national boundaries. Corporations have no problem reaching across the world and finding cheap labor and exploiting resources in other countries. And if we can't figure out a way to break our nationalism and our ethnocentrism and work with communities all over the world and follow their lead and learn from them and figure out how we can take part in their resistance, I think we're going to fail, and we're just going to keep failing. I think that's vital. Veterans for Peace, we are starting to organize more around this issue. We have an open letter now to John Kerry, and I put a link in there to the webpage that we have up now. Please sign this letter if you can. John Kerry comes from the peace movement. He was a Vietnam veteran against the war. He addressed Congress. He threw his medal back during Dewey Canyon. And those are his roots. And, in a lot of ways, we feel that he's forgotten that. Maybe it's some of the damage from the swift boating incidents during his election. But he has to find his roots again, and we have to remind him of that. Our climate team had a meeting with the Special Envoy Office with some of his senior advisors, I guess just a week ago. And it's, it was a good meeting. It was a positive meeting. They were very friendly, very open. They seem to understand a lot of these issues, but they're still using these terms about understanding that climate change is a threat multiplier, and that the answer is greening the military. And we know that that's not the answer. You're not going to make a green bomb and, solve these problems. The biodiesel Navy is not going to solve these problems. We need a massive reduction and, in my opinion, a complete elimination of the U.S. military to solve this issue. So that's what we're going to work on. We're going to keep on putting pressure on the decision makers that can help make these changes. But we're not disillusioned in the fact that having meetings with these decision makers are going to make the changes we need. If we know anything of some of the results today of the Chauvin trial and the justice for George Floyd, that without a massive street presence and without massive mobilization and the threat to do real obstruction tactics, we're probably not going to see the changes we need. And, that goes with the racial justice movement as much as it does with the environmental and peace movements. So let's band together, let's work together, let's get out in the streets, and let's use every tactic in our toolbox to make these changes happen. And I'll leave it to questions.
Thank you so much, Garett. That was an incredibly personal perspective and a very comprehensive overview of how the actions of our military. And thank you again, Natalia, as well. So now we're going to open up the chat for question and answer session. So me and Maryam will be fielding questions as they come in the chat to our respective speakers.
All right, well, to start us off, Natalie, let's see, how do we help draw connections for people who may not see the connections between militarism and climate change? What do you think the most effective route for bringing the two movements together?
Somebody should reread that with better audio.
Can you guys not hear me?
You faded off just a little bit, but I think the question is, how do we make those connections between militarism and climate?
Yes, thank you.
Natalia, do you want to take this?
I can start. I think if we don't make those connections, they're going to get made for us. They're already being made. If we see the increased militarization at the border, you know, my home country, the impacts of climate change are very severe, along with other US foreign policies. Guatemala is one of the least responsible for producing carbon emissions, but it's one of the most impacted. Drought has hit the region. If you ask people migrating, they might not necessarily understand climate change, but they understand that the patterns for growing corn, beans are changing, and they're unable to do that because the seasons are just so completely unpredictable. And the increased militarization at the border goes in tandem with the both climate change, but also the impacts of US foreign military policy in my country. So I think we're seeing that in other places as well as Europe. I'll pass it to you, Garett.
Thank you, Natalia. Garett, do you have anything to add to that? Or?
Yeah, I think that's real. Like, you know, those connections will be made for us. You know, the reason why most Americans, many Americans, don't feel this right now is because we live in privilege and luxury. Most of us, not everybody, obviously. There's many vulnerable communities inside the United States that are feeling the impacts, but most of us live in a bubble, protected bubble, provided by the U.S. military and our corporations by exploiting other nations and making sure that we don't feel those the weight of the crisis that is upon us. But I mean, the reality is, you know, a lot of the world population lives in the coast that's going to be affected by sea level rise. We're going to see more famine, more disease. You know, we're going to see a lot of refugees moving because of climate and because of the war created by a scarcity of resources. And those are going to be people that are going to be crossing ethnic boundaries or religious boundaries. That's going to create a lot of friction, a lot of violence. You're going to see even nuclear powered states that are going to become failed states. And, you know, nuclear weapons are going to fall in the wrong hands. So in the two pivotal things that could be, you know, ultimate life threatening for all human life on this planet are nuclear weapons and climate. They're both interconnected. You know, we're going to see the U.S. military needing to respond more and more all over the world, or maybe not need to, but they're going to respond all over the world. You know, this is just going to be a growing problem, and it's a positive feedback loop that will just be out of control. We have to make changes now. We have to make changes yesterday to stop it from happening. You know, really, it's going to happen. All we can do is mitigate how severe that damage is. And trust me, we need to do everything we can.
At this point, I just wanted to interject here, and that is to invite everybody, if you're interested in joining me, Medea, others tomorrow, and Jody at 1 p.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Eastern time. We're going to have a strategy session with Joel Siegel, who was a former congressional strategist, aide for decades on Capitol Hill. And we're going to talk about the committees and the constituents that we want to mobilize with great urgency to lower this obscene military budget, and specifically to remove the money that's being set aside for a new nuclear arsenal. So email me if you're interested. Carry on.
Thank you, Marcy. So our next question comes from Medea. So to both of you, do you guys think that the Green New Deal currently incorporates enough for a call for demilitarism?
Well, the Green New Deal is just a resolution, right? There are different, it really is a really broad resolution. I think that's trying to get at a humanitarian response rather than a militarized response to climate change, which is the great thing about it. It's really an aspirational, more resolution as I see it from my perspective, maybe not other environmentalists, but that's how I see it. And I think we can draw a lot from it. I think the challenges are that I feel like it's really risky. Some of the strategies that the climate movement are taking are a little bit risky, I would say. Particularly this focus on climate emergency, because generally when we talk about emergencies in the United States, the response is always a militarized one, right? If we look at the drug war, which is the closest thing that I can look at in comparison to what's happening with climate policy right now, this could be the war on climate change, and it could easily just be like a supplantation of policies that really, in the end up impacting Black and Brown people in the global South and Black and Brown people living in some of the most precarious regions of the United States, including the Southern Corridor. So yeah, and just to be clear, we don't currently have a climate and militarism campaign. My work right now, it's really in a small group of nonprofit organizations that have been looking at different pieces of US policy. And my work has been really, right now is being done very much under closed doors because we're just still trying to grasp what this looks like for climate policy. And also because I come from the peace movement. American Friends Service Committee was where I sort of grew up in my activism. So I'm a peace advocate from the onset and can read between the lines with these policies that are coming down through Biden.
Yeah, I think in activism we always sometimes have a bad habit of having this all or nothing policy, and we don't try to achieve those small steps to get to our end result. And we could work on those small steps and still work on the big thing. It's not a compromise. It's just we're working on the small pieces, but it's intimidating to go after the military, and we see a lot of laws get pushed forward. If you look at like the carbon tax, laws, they have exclusions of the military because they know that they could more successfully get this passed if they don't have to fight against the DoD at the same time. So that's a shame. So we're still out there asking for, not to have exemptions for the military, but if it passes, we're not going to poo-poo it and say, oh, we shouldn't have passed the carbon tax laws because it didn't include the military. We just also keep on working on getting the military from the exclusion. So, can we have a better Green New Deal? Hell yeah, of course we can. But we got to also work in the realities of where Congress is at. And, I think what happens on Capitol Hill and what we see in our communities is very different. So, we organize where we're at around the people that are stepping up to do the work. And that's, I think, what the Green New Deal is right now.
Somebody,
Sorry,
I was just going to say, someone posted in the chat, what do you think the prospects are for the US and China to cooperate or collaborate on addressing the climate crisis?
I mean, there has been some positive steps as of late. I think we've seen some steps towards cooperation. I think that that's heartening, and I believe that the kind of cooperation that we need amongst governments, whether it's China or India, the US or Europe, the level of cooperation that we need isn't being met right now. And it's not likely to be met unless it gets really ramped up and all governments really commit to themselves. I think what I find challenging about the China narrative is how xenophobic it can become really quickly, and I think that's also, I think, been a place where, for us at 350, we don't want to contribute to more xenophobia, particularly in a time where fascism and militarism are knocking at our door and beckoning a war.
Yeah, I'm always worried that these things just become a political instrument and a tool, and that sometimes it's used to try to compete with, trying to court the international community to be more on our side than they are on China's side, and it's used as this this instrument to be able to manipulate global situations. And I wish I could feel like the negotiations are genuine and people at the table are trying to actually solve these problems versus just trying to manipulate each other. So I always look at these things with a little shred of skepticism, I guess.
Thank you. So next, we have a question here. What's the alternative to the involvement of the military in humanitarian responses to climate emergencies?
Given the intensity of the day-to-day and the Derek Chauvin verdict, I think this is the same question that abolitionists come up against all the time, which is, what's the alternative to the police? There's lots of alternatives, right? People who are displaced, a lot of the climate impacts are actually going to be felt by people who are internally displaced in this country. And people have not yet realized how many millions of people will be and are already being internally displaced. If you think about Katrina, if you think about the wildfires a couple of summers ago on the West Coast, if you think about the cold snap, not just in Texas, but Mississippi and other southern states, all of those things contribute to displacement internally. And those people don't need an army coming in. What they need is mental health. We know that violence against women increases during climate impacts and disasters, and violence against women and girls. We need people who can address that. We need people who can be there to provide services, including food and warmth and housing, right? Building housing in quickly. So, I think that there's so many similarities that I can think of in terms of, like, what do we do if we abolish the police? There's so many other services that people are needing that they often call the police for. And these governments, these governors and other representatives are calling the military in because they don't have a public institution, a green corps of sorts that can be available to respond during climate disasters.
All right, I don't know if there's another question. Maybe you can or give Garett and Natalia an opportunity just to say some last thoughts before we move on to our calling party. Anything that you want to add?
One last question.
Okay, sure.
It's a good one. So what do you guys think can be done in order to educate and mobilize people in the United States? And what advice do you have for people who have been bogged down in advocating for this movement in order to remain hopeful and optimistic?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I heard the last part very, very well, but how people are bogged down in what? Say that again.
People who in this movement have advocated and have been ignored throughout the process, how can they remain motivated in continuing to fight for this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, I used to feel people didn't take action based on fear of the consequences, whether it was, social or political or prison, obviously, the more vulnerable community you are, the more risk you have taking the streets, especially with new laws being formed every day to protect pipelines and other things like that. But, I think the biggest turnoff and why people don't organize is because they don't think they'll be effective. And, I think that folks don't want to spend their time, their energy, their resources, and obviously risk arrest or worse if they don't think that they can make change. So I think we've got to start, building a movement that's celebrating our small victories and organizing around that. I think we have to create a community and a culture that we want to save, that's built off of joy and friendship and solidarity, so that we're a strong community first. And when we need to take action, we take action as friends and family. And, I think people will be more motivated to get involved and to participate if that's the case.
Yeah, I want to echo that. I agree. I think the culture of our movements is so important to making everyone feel invited. I think at some point or another, some of us didn't know all the things that we know now, and we have to make room for folks who are activated and want to do something, particularly around climate issues. Most Americans want to see national legislation on climate. So there's a lot of Americans that might not be taking action right now, but we could invite and mobilize by creating movements that are really making themselves available to the people, to all the people. I am heartened right now by the youth movements that have made the Green New Deal such a conversation, that have made it a thing that actually we might be able to achieve in different ways. Whether it's Sunrise, Friday for Futures, Climate Strikers. And I'm really heartened by the type of solidarity that they have amongst each other, the type of ways in which they see each other across race and culture. And I have a lot of hope for this generation. I have a daughter that is that around that age, that I just think about, like, what was I thinking about at that age? And she's just so articulate. I'm gonna brag on her. I hope she's not watching. But yeah, I'm heartened by that. And I think that for the conversations around the climate and military policy, I would really love to see peace organizations, Veterans for Peace, CODEPINK, and climate organizations, Greenpeace, 350, Sierra Clubs, coming together and having small strategy sessions to think through what's happening right now and really working together. I think that could be a step that could get us begin to move the needle a little bit in terms of solidarity across movements, which I really believe in.
Great, thank you. What do you say we all unmute and thank our guests? Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The last words were very powerful for me. How are we going to get through this? By building solidarity, by being a community, right? Yeah. So thank you so much. We're going to move into our Capitol calling party. We have 107 people with us, and we hope everybody will stay with us because this is a very important portion of our CODEPINK Congress soon, each Tuesday night. And I want to thank our guests, and I want to thank Mary Miller, who's helping us navigate the tech tonight. Mary, if you wouldn't mind putting up the script on the screen and in the chat, that'd be fantastic. At this point, we ask people to get on the phone and call their congressperson. And here we go. Here's the script. And what are we asking? We're asking them to vote against President Biden's $753 billion military budget, to publicly oppose this, because at this point, it's in the hands of Congress, right? We have two very powerful senators overseeing the budget. There's Bernie Sanders, chair of the Senate Budget Committee, but the military budget is actually overseen by the other Vermont senator, Patrick Leahy. So you can imagine how important it is to mobilize people in Vermont right now to impact this vote. But short of that, we need everybody to come out publicly against this. This is a near 2% increase over Trump's Pentagon spending. And as we heard from our guest tonight, the Pentagon is the largest consumer of oil and largest emitter of fossil fuels, warming the earth. In addition to the 753 billion, well, as part of the 753 billion, just an aside, Biden is asking the Department of Energy for about 46 billion. 3/4 of that would be to start investing in a new nuclear arsenal that is expected to cost nearly $2 trillion in the next few decades. So we want to stop it here, right? So our first ask is that you call Congress. You can call the Capitol switchboard, or if you have your congressperson's number, call them, directly. And then we have an email that you can send. We're also asking them to co-sponsor. I don't know, maybe we should take out the Climate Emergency Act, given what our Natalia said about the concerns over national security, militarized response. So maybe we'll let go of that one. But we can ask them to support HR 2102, which eliminates fossil fuel subsidies. So I'm going to put in the chat to drop HR 794 until we have further discussion around.
This is John Douglas. I'm a constituent living in Santa Barbara. My zip code is
And also call your senators.
Marcy, we can't see the number. We can't see the phone number on the screen.
Again, we're dropping support for HR 794 in light of what Natalia was saying.
Hey, how you doing? Can you connect me with Representative